Okay, let me see. Okay, I just started it again. Hopefully this will work. Okay, got it. That's so weird. I had already started the meeting. And I don't know why I did that. Okay, we're good. Okay, we're good.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hi, ladies. Good morning. Hi, Mommy and Sari from Israel. They're on their way to Yerushalayim, I think. The lucky ones. Okay, we'll wait a couple more minutes just in case where people are trying to log on, and then we will begin. Mommy, you want to tell us something from Israel before we start? Something inspiring you heard? Nope.
So we're on a bus right now, and so it's a little difficult to speak.
Okay.
But I'll do my best. I'm here together with Sari, and we're on a trip with fellow moms. We're traveling through Israel, and it's the fifth year that Palm Beach Synagogue is taking moms to Israel. We haven't gone for 2 years because of COVID, so this year is a very special year. And we have a small group of moms who are here. And all together, we're 130 women on 3 buses from New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is, I guess, it's a lot of from that area, and Florida, Palm Beach, and anywhere else. What's very interesting is that there's buses of moms, and then there's one bus of Maccabi moms. So moms that have teens or children competing in the Maccabi games that are starting next Thursday night is opening night.
So cool.
And I just secured tickets to go to the opening night next Thursday night together with my husband and Cece, so it's very exciting. And so basically we're traveling through Israel and we're learning, so it's not only touring, but it's traveling, and every day there's a different topic. So today was Shalom Bayit, so we'll focus on keeping peace in the home, but not only with a spouse, but with friends, with children, with family.
When it's from Israel.
A more peaceful and serene life. And the concept that peace at all costs, for most of the time, peace is at all costs, and we have to do as much as we can to bring peace into our homes, bring peace into our relationships. Whatever is necessary to do to bring peace, that is the ultimate goal. Yesterday's, is this us? What's that? Yesterday's theme was courage, and the theme was, it was like along the lines of chutzpah, but chutzpah could be good, because when you think of chutzpah, you think of like disrespect, but chutzpah could be also holy chutzpah. Jewish people are stiff-necked people. We got to where we are, and we're in Israel because we're a stiff-necked people, and because we use that chutzpah in a holy way. And our first day was the theme of our first day. What was the theme of the first day? It's usually words matter, but the what was the theme? Second theme of the first day was learning and growth. Like we're right. We have to basically, as the people of the book, we approach everything as learners and internalizing the learning to build our capacity to do good. So what were some of the thoughts? We were a little jet lagged the first day, so I can't say I internalized too much of it. The idea that we're the people of the book and that we learn to do good. What was it? Wise, those who have experience. Right, exactly. Meaning who is wise? One who learns from, learning from everyone. That we're both teachers and we're students. The idea of learning from everyone in every situation, and also respecting those who have more experience and being wise about it, and also the outcome, always anticipating the outcome. So every day there's another theme,
And that's from Pirkei Avot.
we're enjoying it very much. We're meeting a lot of interesting people, and it's wonderful.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing, Stephanie. And my mother, have the
Yes.
best time. We're following your trip. That's beautiful. Thank you. And that teaching my mother just shared is actually from Pirkei Avot. Who is wise? One who learns from everyone. So that's a good segue into our topic today, which is back to Pirkei Avot. Today we are up to chapter 3. Last week we did chapter 2. And today we're going to do something a little different. I really, really love the lesson of this class. It really speaks to me. And for me, it's a game changer. So I'm excited to share it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into 2 different Mishnahs in chapter 3. And then we are going to go inside of a text from Navi, which is prophets, which is going to help us understand today's class. I think it's you could tell me what you ladies prefer, inside the text or outside, but we'll do a little bit of both. So today's lesson, we'll go right into the text. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start off reading today's Mishnah, which is, started at the end. Okay, so chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. Now, it's a long one, but what we're going to be doing is pinpointing a very specific point of the Mishnah. So the whole Mishnah is beautiful and important, but we're going to be focusing on one specific idea here. So to begin, it's interesting to note that last week's Mishnah that we learned, it's a similar idea of reflect upon 3 things and you won't come to sin. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi gives us last week's interpretation of this was very, I think, positive. And Akavia ben Mahalel, the rabbi that wrote this Mishnah, is more looking at it from, I don't want to say negative, but more of an intense, like coming from more fear than love. Just interesting to note, his perspective. So Akavia ben Mahalel Omer, Akavia ben Mahalel, the son of Mahalel, said, Histaka al bashlosha dvarim ve'en ata ba lidei avera. Reflect upon 3 things and you will not come to sin. Which is the same words that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi used that we discussed last week. Da me'ayin basa, know from where you came. La'an ata holech, and where you are going. V'lefnei mi ata asid litain din b'chashbon, and before whom you are destined to give a judgment and accounting. And he goes on to explain. Me'ayin basa, where do you come from? Mipita srucha, from a putrid drop. Ula'an ata holech, and where are you going? Lamakom afar rima v'solea, to a place of dust, maggots, and worms. So you see, he's coming from more of a negative perspective. If you think about, that we all come from nothing and we're going to nothing, then that can stop a person from sinning. V'lifnei mi ata asir litain din v'cheshbon, and who are you destined to give a judgment and an accounting to? Lifnei melech malchei hamlachem hakadosh baruch hu, before the supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. Okay, so this is a long one, and there's a lot of good advice here. So we see that Akavia, the son of Mahalal's statement is that the way to prevent yourself from falling into the hands of sin is to think about the fact that you come from nothing and you're going to nothing. And at the end of days, each person will stand before God in the next world and give a judgment and an accounting. Those are the words he uses, din b'cheshbon, a judgment and an accounting. Now, it's very humbling advice, right? So just to understand where he's coming from, he's not trying to be negative or depressing. It's trying to humble us into realizing where we come from and where we're going. So it's very humbling advice. And I want to zoom in on the two words that he uses, that each person is going to give a din v'cheshbon, a judgment and an accounting before God of all of the things that a person did in their life. Now, it's very interesting that he uses these words, because what does din mean? Din means a judgment, a verdict. And a cheshbon is a reckoning, is an accounting of what happened. And in any court of law, the order goes first the reckoning, first the accounting of what happened, and second comes the judgment. So why does Akavia ben Mahalal switch the order? Why does he say first comes the judgment and then comes the accounting? Right? It doesn't seem like it works that way. Maybe in like in a dictatorship, or in like a country that doesn't have freedom, and the ruler gets to determine the verdict before the accounting, right? Before he gives you a chance to speak what happened. But in a Torah society, in a moral society, first comes the cheshbon, first comes the accounting, and secondly comes the din, comes the judgment. So why is it the other way around? We're going to put this question on pause because I want to move on to the 16th Mishnah, ask another question there, and then we'll come and answer both of them together. So let's put that question on pause, and we're going to read through the second slide, which is, I didn't change this. This is chapter 3, Mishnah 16. Sorry, I didn't update that. So this is chapter 3, Mishnah 16. And here it says that payment is exacted from a person with his knowledge and without his knowledge. Okay, so we have another question here. What does it mean that payment is exacted from a person with his knowledge and without his knowledge? How could it be both? Isn't it one or the other? So the Abarbanel explains this very simply by saying that every person should know that actions have consequences. And whether you can connect the dots and know that this action led to this consequence, whether you can connect those dots or not, no action goes unnoticed, right? So there's always going to be a payment. There's always going to be payment for your actions, whether positive or negative, and whether you realize what they are or not, it's always there. So a person kind of has a choice. Do I want to see my actions as part of a bigger picture, and every action I do has a consequence? Or I could be in denial and just think that my actions, are not worth much, and I can do whatever I want. And even if I do that, and I'm in denial that the fact that my actions have consequences, what the Mishnah is saying here is that they do have consequences, whether you want to recognize them or not. That's the simple explanation of this Mishnah. But our question still stands, because it says payment is exacted with his knowledge, and emphasis on the word and, without his knowledge. If it meant to say sometimes it's with your knowledge and sometimes it's not, depending on what you choose, then it should have said with his knowledge or without his knowledge. Why does it say both? The fact that it says and makes it seem like it's both of them happening simultaneously, right? Both of them are happening at the same time. How could this be? How could payment be exacted from a person both with his knowledge and without his knowledge at the same time? So those are our two Mishnahs from chapter 3. And we're going to connect them and we're going to see what's going on here. And this teaching was actually, this whole class is based on a teaching of the Balsham Tov, who we spoke about a lot in our Shavuot class because the Balsham Tov passed away on Shavuot. We spoke about this personality. Who was he? He was the founder of the Hasidic movement. And it's interesting to note that the Balsham Tov, he didn't write any books. He has no writings of his own. All of his teachings were written by his disciples, by his students. And so this teaching is sourced from the Balsham Tov. It was one of his teachings. However, it was written by a Hasidic Rebbe, who many of you may be familiar with, named Nachman mi Breslav, Rabbi Nachman from Breslav. So if anyone has been to Israel, you've seen Breslaver Hasidim. They wear like the circle kippas that say like Na Nachman on them, and they dance in the streets, and their philosophy is all about joy. So Rabbi Nachman was a great mystic, a great Hasidic Rebbe who lived in Ukraine, and he was a fascinating personality. He lived in Breslav, Ukraine, and he passed away in Uman, which is where he's buried. And unfortunately, Ukraine is not really visitable anymore. But when I used to go in the summer to Ukraine, I actually visited his resting place, his grave, and it's amazing. In Uman, the city feels like Israel, even though it's the middle of Ukraine. And inside his burial site, there's music and dancing. He has his Hasidim, his followers are known to be joyous people that dance and sing everywhere they go. So it's an interesting like contradiction. Like you don't expect a gravesite to have music and dancing, but there was literally people playing guitar and like dancing in his gravesite. So this was who he was. He was a very somewhat misunderstood personality, but very, what's interesting about him, Rabbi Nachman of Breslav, is that he actually passed away at a very young age. He passed away at the age of 38. And so to think about what his movement, the amount of followers he has, even after his passing, having passed away so young, it blows my mind how much this person was able to accomplish in such a short life. And his legacy really lives on, even though he passed away so young. So this teaching, like we said, Rabbi Nachman was actually a great-grandson of the Balsham Tov. So this teaching is sourced from the Balsham Tov, but it was written by Rabbi Nachman in the name of his great-grandfather, the Balsham Tov. So the Balsham Tov asks these two questions that we just asked on Pirkei Avot. Number one, why does Pirkei Avot use the words first judgment and then accounting when it should be the other way around? And number two, from chapter 16, why does it say that it's going to be both with our knowledge and without our knowledge? How could it be both? And so like many Hasidic teachings, this idea is very deep. And we're going to go on a little journey to understand what the Balsham Tov answers. It's a very nuanced and deep idea. And I think like I said before, I think it's a game changer. It's a really powerful lesson. And so I'm excited to be sharing it. In order to understand the answer, we first have to go into a chapter of prophets from Prophet Samuel. And it's a story about King David that the Balsham Tov brings out to understand the answer to these two questions. So before we go into the text, I want to give a little bit of background. This is probably a story that many of you have heard. And now this story of David and Batsheva is one of the most controversial stories in the Torah, I would say. It's very layered and there's so many explanations on this story. And we're not going to go into those explanations today because there's one specific point of the story that I want to focus on that is going to bring us to our answer. But maybe next Shavuot or next time we learn about King David, we will go into this story because it's so interesting and there's so many different interpretations. I'm just making that disclaimer so, just to understand that we're not even scratching the surface of what this story contains. We're just focusing on one point. So the story of David and Batsheva goes as follows. David was the king of Israel. He was the leader of the Jewish people. He lived in a beautiful palace, and he fought many wars in his conquering of Jerusalem and his conquering of the land of Israel. King David's kingship started in Hebron, actually. That was the first place where his kingship resided. And then once he conquered Jerusalem, he moved his kingdom to Jerusalem. And King David, we know the whole Psalms comes from him. He was a great, holy leader of the Jewish people, and he's legendary, really, for the Jewish people. Yet, there's one story that happened with King David that is, like I said, very hard to wrap our minds around. And it goes like this. King David was going to battle with one of the nations in the land of Israel at the time. And King David had laid his eyes on this beautiful woman, Batsheva. And Batsheva was married to a man named Uri Hachiti. And King David, actually at the time, the Jewish law at the time was that before the men would go out to battle, they would give their wives a get. A get is a Jewish divorce. It's a Jewish paper of divorce. And the reason that the men would all give their wives a get before battle is that just in case something happened to them in battle, maybe they were lost, maybe, they didn't have the technology we had in these days where we can track down every person that, God forbid, is lost in battle. But in those days, they didn't have that. And it was very likely that someone would die in battle or get lost and we would never hear from them again. And so just in case a man was to get lost, in Jewish law, the woman can't remarry unless we know for a fact that he died. And if there's no proof that he died, the woman would be what we call an aguna, a woman who's bound, meaning her husband is either we don't know his whereabouts or, we don't know where he is. And that woman can't remarry because there's no proof that the husband is gone. And so the men would traditionally give their wives a get before going to war, just in case something happened to them and they were never to be heard from again. The woman would be free to remarry. And so it says that Uri did give Batsheva a get before going to war. So officially she was an unmarried woman, but we all know that, she wasn't really unmarried. He only gave her the get because he was going to war. They were still a loving married couple. And Uri was sent by David specifically to the front lines of battle. And we know that Uri was killed in battle because he was sent to the front lines. And David summoned Batsheva and he married her. Now, you could say he didn't break any laws, right? He didn't do anything against the law, but this is a good example of something that is wrong, but just because it doesn't break the letter of the law doesn't mean it's not extremely wrong. And we know that David paid for this sin the rest of his life. David says, in Tehillim, he says, Chatasi negdi samid, my sin is before me constantly. David suffered the rest of his life because of this sin of taking Batsheva and sending her husband to the front lines to die. And so let's read the words of Nathan, who was the prophet of the time. And he comes to King David to confront him after David commits the sin of taking Batsheva. And we're going to read the words of Nathan. We're going to focus on the words of the prophet. And it's interesting to note that in those days, it was unheard of to speak truth to power, meaning if a king was in charge, there was the law, but the king was above the law in almost every, country, even today in totalitarian civilizations, right? The king or the dictator is above the law, meaning the people have to keep the law, but the king or the leader, because he's so powerful, doesn't necessarily have to keep the law. Judaism was revolutionary in this way that no one is above the law, right? The Torah, the law applies to everyone equally, whether you're a simple servant or whether you're the king of Israel. It makes no difference. The king was not above the law. The rabbis are not above the law. The scholars are not above the law. No one is. And so even though King David was the leader of the Jewish people, the leader of Israel, the king, it didn't matter. He committed a sin and the prophet comes to confront him. I want to read the words inside I added them to the slideshow because I think it's most powerful to read the word. It's long, so I didn't include the Hebrew, I just included the English. So this is from Samuel chapter 12, Samuel number 2, and we'll read the English. So the Lord sent Nathan to David. This is occurring after David had committed the sin with Batsheva. So Uri has already passed away, and Batsheva has been taken as King David's wife. So the Lord sent Nathan to David. Nathan was the prophet at the time. And he came to him and he said to him, there were two men in one city. So before we go into it, we would expect Nathan to come and start rebuking David, right, for committing this horrible sin. But instead, Nathan starts to tell him a story. He brings him a parable. He says, there were two men in one city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little lamb which he had brought and reared. And it grew up together with him and his sons. Of his bread it would eat, from his cup it would drink, and in his bosom it would lie. And it was to him like a daughter. So we have a rich man, we have a poor man. The rich man has affluence, he has many herds, many animals, many sheep, many goats. The poor man has one little lamb, and this lamb is like his child. It's his only possession. It's his one thing that he takes care of and loves. And there came a wayfarer to the rich man, and he felt bad to take of his own flock and of his own herd to prepare for the guest that had come to him. And he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man that had come to him. So this rich man is very selfish, and he has a visitor, and he wants to prepare a meal for his visitor. And he doesn't want to take of his own flock. So he goes and he steals this poor man's little lamb and slaughters it to feed his guest. This is the parable that Nathan brings to David. And Nathan asks David, what is your opinion on this story? And it's very obvious to us what's going on here, right? Nathan is bringing David a parable because he's trying to teach him a lesson, right? And so what's David's reaction? It says, and David became very angry at the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, this man who has done this is liable to death, and the lamb he shall repay fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, you are the man. And so this parable that Nathan brought to David was in order for David to come to recognize what he had done wrong. And you see that David realizes, he gets very angry. He says, how could someone be so selfish? How could someone be so narcissistic? How could someone have no pity? This poor man has nothing to his name, and you go and you take his only possession. How selfish, how horrible. And Nathan brings out this point in the most subtle way. He says, David, that man is you. You're the one you're the king of Israel. You have this huge palace. You have all the money, all the power in the world. And there's this modest couple, Uri and Batsheva. All they have is each other, this little modest couple. And you go and you take Batsheva, you take this man, Uri's only possession, his amazing wife, you take her from him. You're that man. You're the person who stole this poor man's this lamb. And this, I think it's a powerful parable in itself, but let's try to understand what's going on here, right? We see that that Nathan doesn't come to David and rebuke him head on, right? He doesn't come to him and say, how could you do this horrible sin? He brings him a parable, and he wants David to come to the conclusion on his own. He wants David to make that judgment about himself. And we can make many ideas of why Nathan would do it this way. But the question is really why. Was Nathan afraid of David, that he couldn't, say to David, like, you did something wrong? We said that wasn't the case, right? The role of the prophet was to keep the king in check and to keep all the Jewish people in check. So it was Nathan's right to come over to David and say, even you as the king committed a sin, you did something wrong. Why is it that Nathan disguises it in this story and waits for David to come to the conclusion on his own? And so this is the interpretation that the Balsham Tov gives. He tells this story Do you have a question, Helene? Let's see. Okay, well, if anyone has a question, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask, or you can use the chat box. So this is the explanation that the Balsham Tov gives. He says something very powerful. He says, every person, before anything happens to them in their life, they are consulted by God about whether they want this to happen or not. Now, I was never consulted about the things that were going to happen to me in my life, not that I know of. Maybe I missed the memo, but this is what the Balsham Tov says. He says, what we learned from this story is that before anything happens to a person, they are first consulted about whether it should happen or not. And he says, this is why Pirkei Avot says, din v'cheshbon. First comes the judgment and then comes the reckoning. Because before anything happens to us, we make a judgment. We consent to it, basically. We make that judgment. What does this mean? The Balsham Tov is teaching us a very, very deep and powerful lesson that everything that happens to a person in their life is a result of something that they made a judgment on in the past. Everything that happens to us is something that we consented to, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. And that's the second Mishnah that says whether we understand it or not, it's something that we consented to, something that we judged. And the Balsham Tov teaches this lesson that when we see another person, right, we sometimes judge others, right? We make those judgments for ourselves, right? God presents us these questions, not in the form of ourself, but in the form of others. And when we pass judgment on others, what we're really doing is deciding what's going to happen to us, determining what our fate will be. It's a powerful lesson, and we'll try to unpack it. But basically, this is represented in the story of Nathan and David. Meaning David is passing judgment on someone else, on this man who stole someone else's lamb. And he's saying he should be put to death for what he did. So selfish, so pitiless. He deserves death. And Nathan says, that judgment you made on someone else, that applies to you, David. That's you in that story. And what the Balsham Tov teaches us is that every experience that we have is an opportunity for us to to project our own destiny, our own fate. When we look at another person and we pass judgment on them, we're really passing judgment on ourselves. Because the way we see others is really a reflection of something going on inside of us, right? Everything that we think about other people is really a reflection of our internal world, whether it's positive or negative, right? When we see people in a positive light, it's because we feel good and confident within ourselves, and we can notice celebrate the accomplishments of others. And when we feel judgmental and harsh on other people, it's usually because there's something going on in us. It's not about the other person. It's about you. You're the person. You're the man or the woman. You're the woman who you're really talking about. And so the Balsham Tov teaches this lesson, and he says that's why Pirkei Avot says these two things. Number one, we make a judgment before we have a reckoning. Before we live through an experience, we made that judgment before on someone else. And the reason it says with our knowledge and without our knowledge, it's both, because we make that judgment consciously, but we don't necessarily know the subconscious. We don't necessarily know what's going on internally. And this is because the whole world is divine providence. Everything is connected. Nothing is an isolated event, right? We live in a world that is run by God, and therefore everything is divine providence. And so just because we experience something, or everything we see, every conversation we have with another person, every text message we receive, every interaction we have, is an opportunity for us to determine our own inner world and ultimately our own fate. Because these interactions are really opportunities that God gives us to pass judgment on someone else or another situation, and those judgments really fall back on ourselves. To demonstrate this idea, there's a beautiful saying of the Hasidic rabbis in Chabad. It's one of the Hayom Yoms, the daily lessons that we learn. There's one small lesson every day that the Rebbe taught us. And so it's very simple and it's very short. It says, a mensch is a spiegel. It's in Yiddish. It says, a man is a mirror. What does this mean, a man is a mirror? And the Rebbe's explain that everything that we see, everything we experience in our life is not random. It's a mirror reflection of ourselves. And it's whether we know it or we don't know it. Sometimes we know it and sometimes we don't. And in the same moment, we know it because we're conscious of what's happening in our life. We're conscious beings, but it's also subconscious. Subconsciously, it's a mirror of something that's going on inside of us. And so that's why a man is a mirror, because the Alter Rebbe says something that's a little bit hard to wrap our minds around. And it's something that at first, when I heard it, when I first learned it, probably as a child, I was like, no, that's not true. Can't be. But the older I get, the more I realize that it is true. The Alter Rebbe says that everything that a person sees in another person, everything negative that you see in another person, the reason you see it is because you have that negative trait. And I remember thinking like, no, if it bothers me that my sibling makes a mess, it doesn't mean that I'm a messy person. It just bothers me that my sibling makes a mess. It doesn't mean I'm messy just because I notice that someone else is making a mess. And no, really what it is that inside of you, there's something that has that same quality. It doesn't mean it's in the same, it doesn't mean it expresses itself in the same way. It could express itself in a very different way. But the reason it's bothering you that the other person has that negative trait is because you have it inside of you in a small way. Or in a big way, maybe just in a different, it plays itself out differently. And that's why a man is a mirror, because they say you spot it, you got it. If you see something in someone else and it's bothering you and it like flares out at you, like this person is so whatever, it bothers you because you have it inside, or I have it inside. It's interesting because in recent psychology, we know this idea of a conscious and a subconscious, right? Like Freud brought out this idea that every person has their conscious experiences, and then there's a subconscious that is actually like implanting itself in every action that you take. You have this like subconscious world that's playing itself out, but you don't even realize it. And it's interesting to note that Hasidus had this idea way before, Freud came and brought it to popular knowledge, that every person has a subconscious that is playing itself out, whether we realize it or not. And that's why the Mishnah says, with your understanding and without your understanding, because it's both conscious and subconscious. So really what the Balsham Tov is saying, when we judge others, we're judging ourselves. When I pass judgment on someone else, it's really the reason I care about it. The reason I care that the other person is doing that is because I have it. It bothers me because it's in me. It's within me. And so I'm personally invested because it's within me. That's what we see from the story of David, that David passes judgment on this man in the parable. And Nathan says to him, you are that man. It's you who is playing itself out in that story. And that's why David gets so angry, right? He gets angry at the man. He says he should die and he should pay 4 times the amount of the lamb. He gets so angry. Why is he so upset? Because it's him, because he experienced it. And so it clicks in his mind that this is a bad thing to do, that this is wrong, this is immoral. And it makes him angry because he did it himself, and it bothers him so deeply because it's something he experienced. And so what the Balsham Tov is teaching us is that no experience in life is random. Everything we experience, everything we go through is a din v'cheshbon. It's a judgment that leads to a cheshbon, that leads to a reckoning, because the judgments we make of others, the judgments we make of the things in our life are really a reckoning for our life. It's an experience that we will go through. And that goes for positive or negative. So this is not meant to make us, more judgmental, like, oh, maybe someone's going through something because they make those judgments about others. It's actually for us to turn inward and say, how am I judging others, right? When I see something negative, this is what the Rebbe teaches us. He says, if every negative thing I see in another person is really to teach me a lesson about myself, how can I ever make this world a better place? Because, we're here to make this world a better place. We're here to see the negativity in the world and transform it to goodness. So if everything I see that's negative is really for myself, within myself, how can I balance those two things? And so the Rebbe gives us a very clear distinction. He says, when you see something negative in another person or in another scenario, right? If it bothers you, if it angers you, like David in the story, it says he got angry, right? If it irks you, it gets under your skin. That means that it's something that you have within you that needs fixing. It's not about the other person. The story isn't about the other person, it's about you. Now, if you see something negative in another person and you're right away solution oriented, you right away think of a way to help the person, right away think of a way to make the situation better, that's not necessarily because you have it within yourself. It's because God showed it to you so that you can fix the situation, so you can shed light on the situation and help this person out. So when you see someone with a negative trait and right away you think of how you can help them, that's because God wants you to help them. When you see something negative in someone else and it bothers you, it gets under your skin, that's because it's not about the other person, it's about you. God wants you to do some internal work and fix that trait within yourself. And sometimes it's not so apparent, right? The subconscious is not conscious for a reason. It takes work and energy to uncover what's going on. And so when we right away see something, at least my initial reaction is like, I don't have that. Like, I don't do that. But the truth is that I do it, just in a different way. And sometimes it takes effort to think through, and it takes what we call a cheshbon hanefesh, which is an accounting of your soul, which is, going through, where am I lacking? Where does this negative behavior play itself out in my life, in my actions? Where in my life do I act in this way? And so it's just amazing to think that, like, every person in our life, our spouse, our child, our friends, everything we see that bothers us, that gets us upset, that gets us annoyed, it's really God giving us an opportunity to make a positive judgment, which will ultimately give us a positive fate. We can look at these negative things that happen in our life, God forbid, and say, I didn't choose this. I didn't want this. I didn't choose this. But the Balsham Tov says, did you really not choose this? Did you really not want this? This was a lesson that this occurrence happened to teach you a lesson, to bring you to a higher state. So did you really not choose this? So I think this is an idea that we should discuss because I hope I'm being clear. If anyone has questions or ideas or things that they want to share about this thought. Yeah, I see that, Helene, I think you've been trying to, do you know how to unmute yourself? It looks like, okay, on the bottom left, you can press the little microphone.
Well,
Yeah, there you go.
I hope this relates, but I think it does. Like Rabbi, our Rabbi, your father, he always says, look for the higher good in people. So if you see something bad in them that you don't like, you might have in yourself. But if you try to say, oh, that's not his higher best self, I'm looking for, I'm accepting him despite this.
Right.
So, what I mean? How do you judge that if you're trying to be very forgiving and accepting of somebody rather than they have something bad and I think I have it too, or I know I have it too because I see it in them.
So if I understand your question correctly, that's exactly what the Balsham Tov is telling us. Like, what we have to get to a place is where we don't judge other people negatively. And when we, instead of, if someone's doing something that you deem as wrong, right? By making a negative judgment about them, you make the situation worse, right? When
Right.
we see people in a positive light and we try to help them, we're adding light to the situation instead of dragging it down. You're taking a bad situation and making it worse. So exactly what you're saying, Helene, that we have to add positivity to something that we think is maybe not right. We have to add light to that situation. And that comes through judging people positively. And not what the Balsham Tov is saying is so powerful, because he's saying don't judge people because, the phrase like, don't judge someone until you're in their shoes, right? He's saying it's deeper than that. It's not just don't judge someone because you don't know their circumstance, you don't know the backstory, you don't know what they're going through internally. That's true. But what the Balsham Tov is saying is don't judge someone because the reason you're judging them, the reason you're being judgmental is because of you, not because of them, because there's something in you. And so don't judge someone because you don't know their circumstance, true, but also don't judge someone because the only reason you would come to judging them is because there's something in you that needs judgment. And according to the Balsham Tov, when we judge someone, we're putting ourselves at jeopardy, because when I make a judgment on somebody else, I'm really judging myself. So just like David says, this man did something horrible, he deserves to die. David kind of we said David suffered the rest of his life for this sin that he did. And he kind of made that judgment on himself because he came to the realization that this person, someone who did such a thing, deserves to suffer. And therefore he suffered the rest of his life because he did the sin, but also because he made that judgment about himself, really. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think it goes together, right? The reason we have to think positively about others is because we want to think positively about ourselves. We want to, make our internal world more wholesome and more healthy. They say that when a person points a finger at someone else, what happens if I point my finger at someone else, let's say to blame someone else, I'm really pointing 4 fingers at myself, right? So when I judge someone else, that judgment is only coming about because I have something within me, maybe 4 times as much, that needs judgment or needs fixing.
I
Yeah,
have a
Valentina.
question.
Sure.
So most of us can agree that what David did was wrong and sinful. And maybe we don't have this, it doesn't get under our skin, so it doesn't like really reflect on us, but we want to show them that they did something sinful. If you pointing out something someone did wrong, a judgment or just guidance, like how can you do it without judging? Like, that someone did something wrong and you just want to teach them that they did something wrong without judging. Yeah.
Interesting. That's a good question. It made me think of, I see Sari, so this is why it reminded me of a marriage course that we went to together in Miami. My cousin teaches a marriage course in Miami, and she basically brings up this idea of like, how, if your spouse is doing something that bothers you, right, that you think is wrong. Her whole philosophy was that we should never, even if you say it in a nice way, reprimanding your spouse always leads to a negative outcome. It never really helps. It's never positive. And I remember feeling this way myself, and a lot of women in the class were also bringing this up, like, what do you mean? Like, if he's doing something wrong, don't I have to point it out to him? Like, don't I have to say, like, what's going on? You can't do this. And that's kind of like your question, Valentina. Like, if you see someone doing something wrong, shouldn't you tell them? Like, shouldn't you help your spouse out and say, like, that's not right? And what she said is no, because if you think about it, when you tell someone off, especially a spouse, I guess this is more specifically for a spouse. I don't know if it applies to like your child, but like when you tell off your spouse, what you're really saying to them is, I don't trust your judgment. I don't trust you to make decisions for our family. I don't trust you to make decisions for our children. I don't trust you. And that's the most hurtful thing. And she gave a few examples of how sometimes when she just expressed her needs, she said, this is what I need. And usually he came to the conclusion on his own, which is so interesting. That really was so interesting to me. Like sometimes instead of pointing out the negative that someone else did, there's ways to help them come to that conclusion on their own, which is so much more helpful. Like when someone tells you that, points out something negative that you did, our automatic reaction is to get defensive. Usually it's not helpful unless it's the right person at the right time, usually in most cases, it's not helpful. It usually makes us defensive and upset at that person and only adds fuel to the fire. But there's ways to help someone come to that realization on their own, which is so much more powerful. Like they came to that realization that they did something wrong on their own. And that's also the distinction that we said before, that if your initial reaction is anger or annoyance, it's not your place to pass judgment because there's something in you that needs fixing. If your initial reaction is, how can I help this person? How can I make the situation better? That's a positive thing. That's a good thing. So there is a difference. And the second one is not really judging. It's being solution oriented, right? Someone who's solution oriented, they see a problem not as a problem. They see a problem as a means for resolution. And so when we're solution oriented in that way, we're not passing judgment. We're looking to fix the issue. We're looking to make it better, make things better for you and for the other person. So it's subtle, and that just, I don't know, that the marriage course just came to my head, that idea of instead of rebuking someone, helping them come to the conclusion on their own, which is usually way more effective. I hope that answers the question. There's a story that, there's a Hasidic story of one of the Rebbes that also brings out this idea. The idea of a man as a mirror, that everything we see is a reflection of ourselves. The reason why this is explained in the story, that the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, his grandfather was the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. So it says that when the Alter Rebbe passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe, was very depressed. And it says that he came to shul that night and he had this solemn look on his face, and he was very angry, not angry, he was very sad. He was mourning the loss of his grandfather. And he had this very sad look on his face. And his father came over to him and said something very powerful and said to him, obviously these men were on a very high level. This is something it's just to look up to them and take a lesson. But what his father said to him is, man, you are heaven and earth is a mirror, right? And so the reflection you show to heaven is the reflection that you will receive back from heaven. And so what he was saying to him is, when you exude this negative energy, this depressed energy, that's the mirror that is going to reflect back at you. That's how God is going to, reflect his energy back at you. And so the more we exude positivity and happiness and joy, that's what we're like. It's the law of attraction, really, that the energy that you put out into the world is what's going to be brought back to you. And it's interesting, again, that this modern idea in psychology of the law of attraction, that the energy you put out into the world is what you are attracting into your life, is really a Hasidic idea that we had for centuries, that it's a Torah concept. And there's a famous saying of the Balsham Tov, the source of this whole class, who says, Tracht gut wird sein gut. And this is literally the law of attraction in a Yiddish phrase. Think good and it will be good. It's simple, but that's what it is. If you think positively and you reflect a positive energy out into the world, it will be good. That's what you attract into your life. or the idea of manifestation, right? When a person wants something, there's this concept of like manifesting it. Like I'm manifesting my vacation self. Like even though I'm not on an island in Aruba, I can still manifest a vacation energy of being relaxed and being calm. So that idea of manifestation is the same concept of like, even though, yes, what the Tzemach Tzedek's father was saying, like, yes, your grandfather passed away and you're very sad about it, but is that the energy you want to put out into the world? Is that the reflection that you want to bring into your life of sadness, of depression? And he's not saying that that we can never be sad. He's not saying that, you know, like cheer up, you know, like put on a smile. It's deeper than that. It's really like there is a place for sadness, but there's a place for it. Don't let it take over your life. Don't let it take over your thoughts. Don't let it bombard you, right? You get to control your thoughts. You get to put out whatever energy you want. That's what you could put out in this world. Like you can manifest whatever feelings you want, whatever thoughts you want. So manifest something that you want to be in your life. Like if you manifest sadness, then you're only going to experience sadness. If you manifest relaxation, then you'll feel that relaxation. Like try to put out an energy that you want in your life. And that's trachka, that's ein good. If you think good, it will be good. Another phrase, like quote that comes to mind is Viktor Frankl, right? I always bring him up because he is so brilliant and said this concept of, I think he's the perfect example because Viktor Frankl experienced the Holocaust. He experienced unimaginable suffering. And yet he said this phrase, this quote, this famous quote that he said, I'm not gonna quote it verbatim because I don't know it off the top of my head, but basically the idea that he taught is that the last of human freedoms that no one can take away from you is the power to choose your thoughts and your attitude. And it doesn't matter where in the world you find yourself. For Viktor Frankl, unfortunately, it meant Auschwitz. But he said, and he famously said that the last of human freedoms is the power to choose your attitude and your thoughts. That is something no one can take away from you, no matter what, even the Nazis in his case. No one can take away your attitude. No one can take away your thoughts. And the way you think about other people, what the Balsham Tov is teaching us, is going to be ultimately what you are attracting into your life. When you think negatively about other people, you are attracting that kind of energy into your life. So let's think positively about other people and we can attract goodness and light and positivity into our life. And the more we focus on the good in others, you know, the more we will experience that. And it's true, like when you notice negativity in others, when I notice negativity in others, I could spend my whole day noticing the negative, and what I'm going to end up experiencing is negativity. Like at the end of the day, I'm not going to feel good. I'm going to feel negative. If I always focus on the positive and see the good in others, that's really what I'm going to experience. And that's what I'm going to highlight in my life. So we do get to choose, back to our Mishnah, we do get to choose the judgment before the reckoning. We get to choose the outcome before we even notice it, whether we know it or not, right? Whether it's conscious or not, we get to choose, you know, the energy that we bring into our life. And we can remember these, you know, Yiddish phrases of a man is a mirror, number one, and number two, think good and it will be good, because those two phrases like really encompass this idea of when we judge, the way we judge others is the way we judge ourselves. And yeah, I think also like usually someone who is judgmental of others is also very judgmental on themselves, which is also not a good thing. You know, we're not, just like we are not supposed to judge others negatively, we're also supposed to see ourselves positively. You know, we're not supposed to have negative self-talk. So the more we work on judging others positively, hopefully that'll also translate into the way we see ourselves. And our families and our children and our spouses, because it's all interconnected. So if anyone has any other ideas or questions, please feel free to ask. But with that, we will conclude. Let's see the chat. So somebody said, it's very difficult to check yourself and say it's my problem, especially when your kids don't act the way they should. It's true. It's not easy, but what I think, well, first of all, no one was saying it's easy, but I think when we change our mind shift our mind into thinking about the whole situation differently, meaning you brought up the example of children, right? If someone's child is not acting the way they should, that's what was written in the chat. If someone's child is not acting the way they should, you can either look at it as my child is trying to make my life difficult. My child is, a bad child, God forbid. We label people. This person is labeled in my mind as bad or disruptive, or, we label people in our head. And once we put those labels on, it's very hard to tear them down. So we can either look at it as the child is bad, this child is selfish, they're trying to make my life hard, or from this perspective, what the Balsham Tov is teaching us is the reason this person is acting this way, in this case, the example you brought is your child, the reason they're acting this way is because it's an opportunity for you to learn a certain lesson. God is trying to teach you something, right? And when your child acts a certain way, ask yourself, it's very sensitive, it's very personal, like, what is this bringing up for me? Sit with those feelings, like, this person is acting in a certain way. How does it make me feel? If it angers me, maybe the problem isn't the child. Maybe the problem is me. Maybe there's something in me. Why am I getting triggered? Really, that's the question. Why is this triggering me? And if it's not triggering you, then that's probably a good thing. That probably means that they need your help. And so God is showing you this experience of someone else because he wants you to help them. But if it's triggering you, if it's angering you, ask yourself those questions. Why? Like, is it really about the person or is it about me? Yeah, but it's not easy. I wouldn't say it's easy. It's very, very hard, especially because it's hard to be objective with ourselves. It's hard to be, we're biased, of course. We're biased when it comes to ourselves. And it's easy to say, like, it's everyone else's problem. This person has this, and that person has that, and that person has that. I'm the only good one. Meanwhile, the only reason God is showing you, the struggles of others is because he's trying to point something out in you, in me. So, but it's definitely hard. It's a challenge. So with that, we will end off today's class. Have an amazing day and safe travels to Sari and my mother en route to Jerusalem. And we will see you all next week. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.